Hello, everybody. I'm Doc.
Hi, guys. I'm Janika. Welcome back.
Welcome back to Let's Be Clear with Janika and Doc, our first episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to hit subscribe below and join in the conversation. Feel free to list any feedback, questions, or just overall impressions of the show and the discussions in the discussion section below. All right, so you ready to get started?
Yep.
All right, so Janika and I, we're both licensed mental health professionals. I'm a licensed psychologist.
I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And Janika and I have known each other, for almost 6 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we met at work together about not quite 6 years ago. And we just hit it off. I think it's always a blessing when folks, especially women, can just really kind of connect and sync like that.
I think it's rare.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's some of what we're going to talk about a little about today. And so here we are with Janika and Doc. Why are we doing this show? I know for me, there's a huge, I think, community need for this kind of platform and forum. So many folks, so many of y'all are not going to come in to see us for various reasons. But that doesn't mean that some of these concepts and some of this discussion that Janika and I have, you don't need to be a part of. And so I'm very adamant about that, in terms of having this conversation. And another reason why Janika and I are doing this show is because the professional atmosphere of how we as mental health professionals, I think, should engage with the larger public has changed. I'm just going to say it. It grinds my gears quite a bit. This is not 1975, 1985, or even 1999 when I first entered the field. How we engage the 2019 population as mental health professionals, I think, needs to be revisited. I think that by the time folks get to jails or prisons, or even an inpatient psychiatric hospital, I think that's a little too late. Janika and I both have worked in settings like that, and big ups to everyone who's in the trenches, still doing that work, still being a part of the struggle and a part of recovery. It's not easy for people in that way. However, I think sometimes that's a little too late, because by the time people get into systems such as that, there's a whole other set of issues and concerns that we need that need to be addressed.
You've already been through so many experiences, so by the time you're seeing a therapist or psychologist at a jail or a group home or a hospital, you're probably 17, 18, 20s, and you've had a whole lifetime of experiences that have shaped you. And I'm just going to put it bluntly, by the time you're seeing us, I'm assuming it's going to be a negative experience or a deeply negative experience, right? Most people don't come to a therapist or psychologist because life has been so amazing and so wonderful.
No.
That doesn't happen.
Most of the time, people come to people like Janika and I, psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, licensed clinical social worker, when there is trouble, when things haven't gone quite right.
Over a long time. Right. It's not like I think most people, if you have one negative experience, you can kind of get over it usually.
Recover, bounce back a little more quickly.
Right. In a healthier way. It's when it's been constant.
Chronic over
you're
years.
Constantly doing these uphill battles over years since you were a kid. It's been uphill battles. And so by the time you see us in a jail or a prison or group home or inpatient, you're tired of these uphill battles, right? And so you're finally seeing a therapist or a psychologist, and they're trying to, in a really short amount of time, because at that level of care, there's Medicaid involved, there's these other systems and third-party payers that dictate how long we can see you.
Right.
And it makes it difficult to now go back and talk about all these things you've been through.
Or the parameters within which we can see you. Right. And so, depending on where you're working, what kind of setting professionals are working in, those organizational needs and vision and mission statement for how they would like mental health professionals to provide the treatment
Right.
sometimes take precedence and priority. Or sometimes there could be a conflict between how the respective professional thinks they should engage versus what the larger organization is saying how they should engage. And so those are some of the things that I think people such as those who are inmates or those who are at any particular patients sometimes get caught in the middle.
Right. You get caught, you become a casualty of that.
Right.
And I think for me, my goal in having these discussions is to, whether you are a young adult, whether you are a parent, and you feel like this applies to you or your child or whomever, right? To bring this conversation to you. And if you feel like you identify with it and you need some resources, let us know. We can put some links down below and kind of direct you to help you find some providers.
And even for me, as you know, speaking to the other side of our audience, other mental health professionals, I think it's time for us to rethink our methods. I think there's definitely a need for community engagement. And before everybody gets started, I'm not, let me be very clear. I'm not talking about going into the public and soliciting clients. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is how do we as professionals and providers really begin to think differently or to think about new and innovative ways for how we address all of this mental health stigma. That's like a catchphrase now that's running rampant in our society. So many of us are invited into a conversation that's already existing. And Janika and I believe that for us as mental health providers, as licensed professionals, we need to start and lead the conversation. For example, Taraji P. Henson just founded her mental health foundation, the Boris Lawrence Henson Foundation, named for her father. Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry are currently in production for doing a multi-part documentary series on mental health. And we've seen with the R. Kelly, what was that? Surviving R. Kelly. We saw that documentary, and while there were mental health professionals who had a presence there, and how I'm sure at some of these, more larger national events and initiatives, while we're there, I think that we need to grab the bull by the horns and really kind of steer that conversation. Because I think that how else do we really kind of counter or begin to counter some of the stigma around issues related to mental health, issues related to why people sometimes don't come in to see us, if we're not actually being more of a visible and salient part of the public forum and of the conversation. Many of these mental health problems and concerns often begin in the home. Whether or not it's through early childhood experiences, the beliefs, attitudes, and perceptions within which we are indoctrinated into or that we are exposed to from our caregivers or significant others in our homes. Ain't nobody trying to mommy shame or parent shame, but what we are saying is that a lot of what we are taught to believe about mental health, behavioral health problems, and treatment begins in our homes.
Well, I think not just about mental health, but just our worldview in general. Right. Whatever it is, whether it's especially like, for example, relationships. One of the first things that I go over with couples that we don't even think about is, well, kind of what is your view of a relationship? What's your view of husband or wife or mom or dad or partners or however you want to label it? It comes from our parents, it comes from our caregivers, our family of origin, it comes from home.
Right.
And so to say that, kind of what happens at home stays at home is not accurate. It's not fair because you take it with you.
And it's not helpful.
No.
All right. And so, that's part of, I think, a huge cultural belief. Like, we're not putting our business in the streets. That belief sometimes can refer to being gossipy, but I think, at least in my experience over the years, that really kind of speaks to, I'm not going out talking to some stranger that I don't know, telling them about my business. These are conversations and these are concerns, discussions that there's no need to feel ashamed or embarrassed about. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Janika and I wanted to back up a little bit and go to an exchange that we both saw the other day.
And all of you saw it too.
All of you saw it too at the U.S. Open between Naomi Osaka and Coco Gauff. I know there's been some conversation and some chatter about that exchange, but I think there's room for more conversation, especially for Janika and I to discuss, to give our impressions.
I'm just going to watch and see what happens.
And so the exchange that happened was at the end of the match. Coco was visibly upset, obviously upset about her loss. And Naomi went over, to encourage her and to invite her into her post-match interview. And even before that, there was one point in the match where Coco had done an amazing return in a volley between her and Naomi even clapped for her because that was such an amazing level at which both of them were playing. And so the thing that stood out to me about that exchange the most is that was just the opposite, in my opinion, of what we saw last year at the finals match between Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka. And so for me, I'm just going to be honest with you, I felt very bothered and disappointed in Serena Williams' behavior last year at U.S. Open in that match. And I felt very encouraged by Naomi's behavior. Let me tell you why I felt disappointed. I do think that, obviously, there is racism and unfair treatment that many people of color are exposed to. But I think I was disappointed more in her because the greatest of all time isn't just about how well you play or how well you represent yourself in your respective field. It's also about, in my opinion, your behavior, your demeanor, how you act like the greatest of all time off the court as well. And so I was very bothered to see her act that way in front of another woman of color.
I mean, I get it. I didn't feel so disappointed by her. I felt like a lot of that situation was hyped up by the fans, because part of what I recall was that even though Naomi won, they were chanting Serena's name. They weren't really...
But I think Serena helped to fan that flame some by her behavior during the match.
I don't mean that. But hold on. But what I mean is, as an athlete, and speaking to that racism that she's constantly dealing with, that constant having to be prepared to defend yourself in the match, right? Yes. That is between her and the ref. And I get that. But then when other people are then... When the fans are then jumping in and afterwards not letting Naomi kind of have her spot, have her moment, that I don't know if you can then say that is on Serena. I don't think you can say that she fanned that flame because of an argument she had with the ref or because of unfair calls and a conflict between her and the ref.
I disagree.
I don't think that's fair to say and put that on Serena.
I disagree.
Because she does a lot off the court for black women.
But I think in that arena in particular, at that particular moment in time, when all eyes are watching, I think that us as people of color, especially women of color, I think that we have an additional onus and responsibility. And so I guess for me, my issue or my contention is, and chime in, sound off below. I believe that when people of color, especially us as women of color, find ourselves in positions of leadership and positions where we really have a platform, I think that we have an additional responsibility to be even more careful for how we conduct ourselves. And I think that in that way, from what I saw, at least in my opinion, from the exchange between Osaka and Golf on Saturday, I think that Osaka said just that in her behavior without even having to say a word. And that's more of kind of like what I'd like to see more in our everyday interactions. There's room for everybody to eat. I think sometimes we get so concerned about our profit or our brand or our business or our coin, our check, our contract, our this, our that.
Right.
I think sometimes that creates an unnecessary antagonism that really just shouldn't and doesn't have to be there. And for me, I was most encouraged to see two young women of color share that stage differently, but still share that stage in a more cohesive way. And I just think, and I do know that Serena does a lot for women, especially women of color off the court. But for me, that just left a bad taste in my mouth, how I perceived her behavior on that kind of stage, that kind of platform at that moment.
I see it differently.
Okay.
And I think there are a couple different layers to it. I think some of it's very cultural.
Yes, in terms of...
I think Naomi's, personality, demeanor, I think how she responds to things. I think some of that is, Serena, I think coming up and being kind of a pioneer in the sport, you then have to fight. You
always have
and
to
you see
fight.
how her dad was very...
Yes, Mr. Richard did a great job with him.
He did.
He did.
But to the way he groomed them is, you are the greatest, don't let them take your spot.
Right.
You're going to fight for what's yours. And
I think that's also part of a narrative and a backdrop that many black folks have.
Yes.
Because we're always so used to being on the defensive that we're ready to have to jump in and defend ourselves. Sometimes when I don't think we necessarily have to. But I think sometimes it's hard to differentiate.
Yes, and I think this is one of those moments for Serena. But Naomi her mother is Japanese and her father is Haitian.
Yes.
And so her story is going to be different than that. So her family of origin is different. And I think we also have to keep in mind, could that be why she's does that have anything to do with how she presents herself? And so I think that's a part of it. And also I think, kind of as a last point between Naomi and Coco, is that last year with Naomi, she felt a lot of emotion and then kind of like shut down a little bit. She brought her visor down, she hid into herself. And
she shrunk into herself.
Yes, before bringing Coco into her interview, she said, let them know how you feel.
Right.
And so I think it was more about sharing how you feel rather than the hype and all of that. It was more just about being vulnerable and authentic in that moment, because she had, it was a lot of emotion for her, and she won last year.
Yes, she
did.
did.
And it wasn't, that was, right when the match ended.
Yes.
But everyone was still chanting Serena's name. And so she was feeling a lot, I'm sure, and couldn't even really process it with all the noise.
Internally as well as externally.
I don't think people would let her have that moment, right? And so
I think it was difficult for Serena to let her have that moment, to a degree. Especially when you are the greatest, you are the pinnacle, and maybe your time has come.
Yes.
To pass the torch, right? You have done what you needed to do times infinity. So, sound off below.
Let us know.
Let us know what you think.
Because we can keep going.
Because we can keep going, right. And so, lastly, Janika and I saw something in the news that just made the news about a week and a half or two ago.
Yeah.
A pregnant woman in Denver, Colorado, in a jail cell, allegedly gave birth to a baby boy last July 31st, 2018. And she's filing a lawsuit. And in the lawsuit, she alleges that the medical nurses and the deputies ignored her pleas for help during hours of labor. And so just FYI, Janika and I are going to include a link to the video as well below our video, so check it out. And the prison officials alleged that a van was requested to take her to the jail. First, let me start off by saying, as someone who's worked in these kinds of correctional settings, both of us, for many, many years, I've worked in these settings across the country. The ultimate and primary goal in these correctional settings is to maintain safety and security of the facility and of the inmate. Safety and security comes first while providing any needed medical care. But in the video, it looks like, first of all, how do you, this woman, in these kinds of settings, there's an infirmary or a medical wing. There's a medical unit. And so typically women who are pregnant, obviously pregnant, belly showing 5, 6, 7, 8 months, 9 months pregnant, a lot of times are moved off of the unit into a medical unit for safety and security. And they are typically seen more often by the nurses and by the medical providers. So for me, I want to know, at this stage in her pregnancy, what she was still doing there, especially with labor.
So part of it, in the video, they mentioned how, I think she was arrested for fraud. Well, she was, I think, 8 or 9 months when she was arrested. So
very far along.
When she came in the jail,
right,
she was already further along in her pregnancy. So you knew this woman was going to give birth soon.
Right.
Just by knowing how babies come into the world.
Right.
You know the process. So in the video, you then see her asking, because
she goes to the door, right?
She goes to the door,
and she asks for help, and I'm pretty sure she was loud.
Yeah, you can tell by the way this woman is wailing that she was probably loud. They give her a pad, and like one of those big ones you would put on like a bed for someone who like wets the bed. And that's it. Now, again, this whole safety security thing, right? As someone who's worked in a facility, I appreciate that.
Yes, we both do.
Listen,
absolutely.
Seeing some stuff, I appreciate.
Yes, we both do.
That you care about safety and security. However,
but does it really take hours for a van for a woman who's in active labor?
It does not.
Does it really take hours?
Even if you don't have a van available,
call the ambulance. Call the sheriffs.
You can do that. It's part of the protocol.
Yes. Typically
part of the protocol. For those who aren't aware, these type of institutions have a protocol.
Yes.
For everything.
For everything. Fire, earthquake, flood.
Medical emergencies.
Have a protocol. Absolutely. So I'm pretty sure the physician, or hope at least, the physician over top of the medical infirmary was paged, if not called.
And so not just that, but again, safety and security.
Yes.
You then would not send someone to the hospital alone. Right? Because safety and security.
Absolutely. So she would go with escorts. Correctional escorts.
So to sit there and deny someone medical care and trying to frame it in the vein of safety and security is a cop-out. At what point do you just acknowledge the fact that I do not view you as human? And because of that, I don't give a damn. I just don't give a damn.
For me, that's the real issue.
Me too.
For me, I think that's the heart of it, because I think that just like slavery and just like the Holocaust, when you dehumanize and when you objectify somebody, it's very easy to treat them any old kind of way. Right, because then here the logic in that and the defense, the same way you would say, well, they were a slave or they were a Jew. In this case, they were an inmate. They were an inmate. I don't care. And let me be clear. I know that our correctional facilities and settings exist for very, very dangerous people. Yes. Who engage in very inhumane behaviors. Yes. In fact, I'm very thankful that there are correctional facilities because some people need to be there for their own good, not just for the good of the sick, the general public, but for their own good, to keep them from engaging in those behaviors.
Right.
But does that mean that even though they engage or acted in an inhumane way,
right,
that the response or that the treatment that they are then exposed to in these correctional settings is then inhumane? So are we matching inhumanity with inhumanity at that point?
Right. Right. And I think, you know, I've seen people who are able to kind of do their job without minimizing someone's humanity.
I think that's rare, and I think that's rare. Difficult.
And you have
because
the
climate of a lot of these settings,
right,
can be just the opposite.
But what I'm saying is there are some people who are mindful that my job is to make sure things are safe,
yes,
not to treat you less than. Right? There is a difference.
Then to be another jury and convict you, judge and jury.
You know, even when I worked in the jail, my job is not to convict you. That was not my job.
Right.
My job is to deal with your emotions, your mental stability,
your adjustment,
your health,
how you're managing your adjustment to the setting.
That's my job. My job is not to convict you. The problem is when you have people who have a superiority complex and think that it is their right to judge someone based on what they've done, who they are, what they are.
And let me be very clear within saying that, in my opinion, there for the grace of God go I. Listen. Because at any given moment, and I can hear some people saying now, no, Doc, you're wrong. That would never be me.
Well, it's so easy to get arrested.
Let me be very clear with you. If anybody were to come and bother my daughter, I'm just going to be honest with you. I believe that is my God-given right to defend her if somebody has bothered her. And so at any given moment, many of us, there for the grace of God, go us. And so with that said, I think that we should be very cautious and tempered with how we not only see people who are incarcerated, but then how we suggest that they be treated when
I think the reality is plenty of people don't see people.
Objectifying. Again,
right. They see
when
charges,
when
offense.
You can objectify somebody, when you can minimize or see them as less than human, it's easier to treat them.
But the reality is we have all done something that we are not proud of,
right,
that we don't boast and talk about 24/7.
Right.
And if someone took the thing that you were most ashamed of,
yes,
that you were most hurt by, and brought it up to you every single day,
right,
24/7,
right,
and addressed you by it, how would you feel?
Right.
You wouldn't like it, right? So why then do you get to do that to somebody else? What gives you the right to do that to someone else? And in this particular case, what gives you the right to judge someone else who has not just a medical need in that moment, but just a human
need? A human being. And which, for the record, the lawsuit alleges that her baby had been born for several minutes before he was actually attended to.
And part of the lawsuit says had she waited any longer before going to the hospital, she would have bled out. Right, and let's also look at it from a medical perspective.
Right.
The miracle of life is actually very difficult.
Right.
Right. How many women have died in childbirth? How many women have had complications? How many women can't even...
With the best of medical circumstances and care and settings.
You know, how many women have had, just unforeseen circumstances that now put her life or the baby's life at risk, and you're leaving this woman.
So imagine, for those of us who birth children, imagine that giving birth to a child, you're already in duress because you're in jail or prison. Add on top of that you're pregnant. And so the impact of that kind of emotional, physical, psychological duress on your process of finishing carrying this baby to term and then giving birth to the baby in that kind of setting. And let's be clear, in the lawsuit and in the news report, the woman did not deny or try to minimize or dismiss her culpability in her actions. Now, some of you may say, well, if she was that mindful, why did she do that when she was 8-9 months pregnant?
One has apples and oranges, right? Apples and oranges. again, you did what you did.
Right.
You have to be accountable for your charge. That does not mean you don't need medical care.
Right. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Right. There's still a baby that has to be born here.
Right. Right.
You have to go to trial if you choose to, or take it, whatever your legal process is going to be, you have to attend to that when the time is right. The reality is, you get arrested in January, you may not go to trial for another year. So, if the baby's then going to be born...
That's depending on what the charge is.
Depending on the state, the charge, several factors.
Also, SES, because many people of color cannot afford paid attorneys, so they are left
with public defenders.
For public defenders.
And in this case, the woman was Latina.
A woman of color.
She was a woman of color. So let's add that on top. There are so many factors to this situation that need to be addressed, and you cannot just dismiss it. Well, she did what she did. I didn't ask about that.
Right.
And if that is your go-to, then you really need to examine yourself, because no one is asking you about her charge. No one is dismissing. No one is saying she shouldn't be there. At no point in our conversation have we ever said that people didn't need to be in jail.
Right. But what we are saying is that
you still have to treat them as human beings.
Not to minimize and objectify such folk when they do find themselves in that setting. And if and when you are in a position of actually helping to maintain their safety and their security. All right? So that's it for today, folks. Sound off in the discussions below.
I want to hear your thoughts.
We want to hear your thoughts. Let's engage in some fruitful, positive, and solution-focused conversation and discussion. Follow us on Instagram at Let's Be Clear with Janika and Doc.
Mm-hmm.
Hit subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Have a good week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.